The European Commission spent 2 years building what it believed was an inescapable legal trap around Elon Musk and X. They had the law, they had the investigators, they had 27 nations worth of regulatory authority, and the most aggressive digital enforcement machine ever constructed pointed at one man and one platform. The fine they announced was north of 120 million euros. The compliance costs on top of it would have run higher still. Every tech company that had faced Brussels before had eventually done the same thing. They had calculated the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance, and they had written the check. Musk did not write the check. He did not negotiate. He did not send a diplomatic legal letter requesting more time. He filed a lawsuit against the European Commission in the EU's own court in Luxembourg, and the arguments his legal team placed before that court are not the arguments of a company trying to reduce a fine. They are the arguments of a legal team that believes it can prove the European Commission conducted a politically motivated investigation, broke its own procedural rules, and used the most powerful digital enforcement law in the world not to protect European citizens, but to silence a platform whose owner held political views that Brussels found threatening. The hunter just became the hunted, and the European Commission has no clean answer for what is coming. To understand the full dimensions of what Elon Musk just did by filing this lawsuit, you have to go back to the beginning of the conflict and trace how it actually developed, because the public narrative around the relationship between X and the European Commission has consistently missed the structural dynamics that made this confrontation inevitable from a very early point. When Musk completed his acquisition of Twitter in October 2022 and began the process of transforming it into X, the signal he sent to every government and regulatory body watching was unambiguous. He was not going to operate the platform according to the content moderation philosophy that Silicon Valley's previous generation of technology executives had developed in close consultation with governments and civil society organizations over the preceding decade. He fired the teams that had been responsible for enforcing the policies that governments had come to rely upon. He reinstated accounts that had been banned under the previous regime. He opened the platform's algorithmic architecture to a degree of public transparency that his predecessors had consistently refused. He declared repeatedly and loudly that his intention was to make X the closest approximation to a genuine free speech environment that a global commercial platform could practically be. European regulators did not receive this declaration as a philosophical statement about democratic values. They received it as a direct challenge to the regulatory framework they had spent years constructing and that they had been preparing to deploy against exactly this kind of platform behavior at exactly this kind of scale. The Digital Services Act had been years in development before Musk acquired Twitter. It represented the European Union's most ambitious attempt to establish binding legal authority over how large online platforms moderated content, handled user data, provided transparency to regulators and researchers, and managed the algorithmic systems that determined what hundreds of millions of people saw when they opened their feeds. The DSA's architects had designed it specifically to address the perceived failures of voluntary self-regulation that had characterized the previous era of platform governance. The law was not a request. It was a mandate backed by financial penalties calibrated to be large enough to be genuinely painful even for the most profitable technology companies on Earth. Platforms with more than 45 million users in the European Union were classified under the DSA as very large online platforms and subjected to the law's most demanding requirements: regular independent audits, comprehensive transparency reporting, detailed risk assessments covering the potential harms their systems could produce, full cooperation with regulatory investigators, and for non-compliance, fines reaching up to 6% of global annual revenue, a figure that for a company of X's scale translated into the hundreds of millions of dollars range. The European Commission formally designated X as a very large online platform in April 2023. The investigation that followed moved with unusual speed and unusual public visibility, both of which X's legal team would later argue were themselves evidence of the political rather than purely regulatory character of what the Commission was doing. In December 2023, the Commission launched a formal investigation citing 3 primary areas of concern: illegal content moderation with particular reference to material related to the conflict in Gaza that had begun 2 months earlier, transparency around advertising systems, and data access provisions for independent researchers. The public framing of the investigation presented it as a straightforward application of the DSA's enforcement mechanisms to a platform that was demonstrably failing to meet its legal obligations. Musk's response to the investigation was conducted simultaneously on 2 levels. Publicly, he was contemptuous, posting on X itself about the Commission's demands in language that ranged from dismissive to openly derisive, describing the regulatory process as an attack on free speech and characterizing the Commission's investigators as political actors pursuing an ideological agenda rather than genuine legal compliance. Behind closed doors, EX's legal team was conducting a different kind of engagement, fighting a detailed and grinding procedural battle over every document request, every data demand, and every aspect of the investigation's methodology that they believed deviated from the Commission's own established guidelines. In July 2024, the Commission issued its preliminary findings. X had likely violated the Digital Services Act across multiple dimensions. The language of the preliminary finding was constructed to send a message that extended well beyond X itself to every platform operating in Europe that was watching how this confrontation resolved. The Commission was demonstrating its willingness to pursue enforcement action against the largest and most politically connected platform on its target list. Then something happened that legal experts across Europe described as genuinely unexpected. In early 2025, the Commission quietly dropped several of the most significant charges from its case against X. The disinformation-related charges tied specifically to Gaza content were shelved without a public explanation that satisfied the legal community's questions about why charges that had been presented as central to the investigation's justification were suddenly no longer being pursued. The timing coincided with the return of the Trump administration in Washington and the new administration's early and explicit signals that it viewed European regulatory action against American technology companies as a form of economic aggression that the United States government intended to treat as a trade policy matter rather than a purely legal one. Whether the charge reduction reflected a genuine legal reassessment, political pressure from Washington, or some combination of both, became a subject of intense speculation that the Commission declined to address with the specificity that the question deserved. What was not dropped was the core finding and the financial penalty attached to it. In March 2025, the Commission made its final determination official. X had violated the Digital Services Act. The penalty was 15 million euros in direct fines paired with compliance requirements whose implementation cost was estimated at over 100 million euros additional. The total financial exposure exceeded 120 million euros, and the Commission set a deadline for compliance that was designed to be taken seriously. Musk's response was the lawsuit, filed directly in the EU General Court in Luxembourg, challenging not only the fine itself but the procedural legitimacy of the entire investigation, the legal basis on which specific DSA provisions had been applied to X, and the constitutional compatibility of those provisions with fundamental rights protections embedded in EU law, including freedom of expression and the right to conduct a business. The arguments X's legal team placed before the court are considerably more substantial than the public coverage of the lawsuit has generally conveyed. They are not the arguments of a company seeking a technical reduction in a penalty it essentially accepts as legitimate. They are the arguments of a legal team that believes the investigation was constructed backwards, that the Commission determined the outcome it wanted to reach and then built the evidentiary case around that predetermined destination, and that the internal documents produced through the legal discovery process contain the proof of that construction in the Commission's own words. The internal documents are where this case transforms from a regulatory dispute into something that the European Commission's legal department is treating with a level of alarm that its public communications have been carefully constructed to conceal, because the discovery process that accompanies litigation in the EU General Court is not a process that institutions accustomed to operating behind closed doors find comfortable. It requires the production of internal communications, working documents, meeting records, and correspondence that was created in the expectation that it would never be examined by an adversarial legal team in an open judicial proceeding. And what EX's lawyers have been extracting from that process, according to sources close to the litigation, is a picture of the Commission's investigation that looks considerably less like neutral regulatory enforcement and considerably more like a targeted political operation that used the DSA as its legal cover. The specific allegation at the center of X's case is one that the mainstream coverage of this lawsuit has consistently underweighted relative to its actual legal and political significance. EX's legal team is arguing with documentary support that senior Commission officials during the investigation discussed X not primarily in the language of regulatory compliance, but in the language of political threat management. That internal communications reference Musk's public statements and his visible support for specific political figures and movements in Europe and the United States. that the investigation was accelerated and its public profile deliberately elevated at moments that corresponded not to new legal developments in the case, but to moments when X's political influence in European public discourse was most visible and most concerning to people operating at the senior levels of EU institutional power. If those allegations are supported by the documents in the way that X's legal team is representing, the implications extend far beyond the outcome of this specific case. They go to the foundational question of whether the Digital Services Act, as the Commission has been enforcing it, is a genuine legal framework applied consistently and impartially across platforms according to objective criteria, or whether it is a selective enforcement instrument whose application is shaped by political judgments about which platforms and which platform owners represent acceptable versus unacceptable concentrations of communicative power. That question is one that the Commission has no interest in having examined in open court. It is also precisely the question that the General Court is now going to have to engage with in some form as this case proceeds. The Commission's public response to the lawsuit has been notable primarily for what it has not contained. Ursula von der Leyen, who invested substantial political capital across her second-term mandate in positioning herself as the European leader who successfully brought Silicon Valley to heel, has said almost nothing substantive about the lawsuit since it was filed. The institutional communications coming from the Commission have been confined to brief statements about respecting legal processes and expressing confidence in the strength of the Commission's legal position, the kind of language that press offices produce when they have been instructed to say as little as possible while maintaining the appearance of institutional composure. Behind that composure, sources with visibility into the Commission's legal operation describe an environment that is considerably less composed. The General Court is not an institution that awards political deference to the Commission's preferred outcomes. It has overturned Commission decisions in significant cases before. It has ruled against the EU's most powerful regulatory bodies when the procedural and substantive legal arguments demanded it, and it approaches questions of fundamental rights, including freedom of expression, with a rigor that the Commission's investigators may not have fully accounted for when they were constructing the case against X in the political environment of 2023 and 2024. The timing of the lawsuit has added a geopolitical dimension to what might otherwise have been a purely legal proceeding. By the time X filed in early 2025, the political landscape across Europe and across the Atlantic had shifted in ways that created a context for the litigation that is impossible to separate from the legal arguments themselves. Far-right and right-wing parties had made substantial electoral gains across multiple major EU member states. The Trump administration had returned to Washington with an explicitly stated agenda of pushing back against European regulatory actions targeting American companies, and had already begun integrating that agenda into its broader trade policy framework. Musk himself had by this point taken on a formal advisory role to the Trump administration through the Department of Government Efficiency, a position that made his lawsuit against the European Commission not merely a corporate legal action, but a direct collision between a senior figure in the American executive branch and the EU's most powerful institutional body. That collision does not stay inside the courtroom. It radiates outward into the transatlantic relationship, into trade negotiations, into every bilateral conversation between Washington and Brussels that touches on digital regulation, technology policy, or the broader question of how American and European approaches to governing the internet can be reconciled, or whether they can be reconciled at all. The Commission finds itself conducting a legal defense in a case brought by a man who occupies a position of formal influence in an administration that has already signaled its willingness to treat European digital regulation as a trade aggression issue requiring a trade policy response. The external pressure that context creates on the Commission's litigation strategy is not something that can be acknowledged publicly without making the Commission's position worse, but it cannot be ignored internally without making strategic decisions that fail to account for the full scope of what the institution is actually facing. Beyond the geopolitical complexity, there is a purely legal vulnerability in the Commission's position that X's lawyers have identified and are pressing with the specificity that comes from having had time to examine the full evidentiary record. The disinformation charges that were dropped in early 2025 were dropped after having been